Hello guys, welcome into my Blackguard basic guide video here. I'm going to go over some talent builds, some renown builds, and some gearing options. We're going to go ahead and start with the spec choices. Blackguard has a lot of variety, a lot of different builds, so I'll try to go over the common ones and the ones that I like. I guess the first one I would probably call this more of a generic two-hand BG spec. This one's probably going to be run pretty common with most of your two-hand BGs. Path of Malice, we want to take Enraged Beating. This is a great way to open a fight. Channel it hits very fast, so it regenerates a lot of hate for you. The Anytime Knockdown, kind of self-explanatory with two hands since your baseline knockdown is based around a shield block. And then we have Crimson Death. This is probably the key ability for running two-hand BG. It's an AoE incoming crit debuff for enemies, as well as a hard-hitting DD. So this is what kind of ramps up your group's DPS by adding that crit chance onto the enemy targets. Leftover points are going to go into Path of Loathing. Personally, I like running Terrifying Foe and Anger Drives Me with Wave of Scorn. So this is basically a toughness multiplier. Try to activate it once at lower hate and then again at higher hatred. That way you get a toughness buff up quickly for a little bit of extra toughness, and then you get the big juicy buff again when you have your resources maxed out. Anger Drives Me. This is kind of if not mandatory for basically all BG builds, especially two-handed. This is a big parry tactic. It can give you up to 30% additional parry. The only way to counter incoming guard damage is through parry and block. So as much parry as possible on BG is really big for two-handed. And then Wave of Scorn, this is a nice AoE snare. It's got a 40-foot frontal cone, so it's actually got a little bit further distance than even guard range. So this can be pretty nice for getting on top of ranged and kiters and all that. So this is what I would call kind of the generic or common two-hand spec, at least that I'm aware of. Some additional specs that you can also look at. I would say this one's probably more for solo play. Depending on how you're building your Blackguard, you may consider this in some smaller groups, but this would focus on the self-heal from Bolstering Anger. 60-second cooldown. It converts your resource, your hatred, into health. Elite Training is also pretty big from this tree. Pretty much gives you and your Dark Protector a 100% chance to parry disrupt the next 4 incoming attacks. Soul Killer, if your role in a group is to get that heal debuff up to add extra pressure on the healers, this is pretty useful to slot. This is kind of a healer bully. Choking Fury can be useful if you're trying to AP drain healers, AP drain MDPS. These tactics, I don't know how much they're run, the Disrupt and the Detaunt Dispel. I could see maybe in solo play, the Detaunt Dispel being more useful when you're trying to kill things like DPS AMs and maybe White Lions when they try to detaunt and run, stuff like that. There is also a very strong sword and board build that you can put together as well. It combos really well with DOKs for the classic BG Doc duo, but it can also play just very well in general too. It makes you a very defensive, very support-based tank class. And most of those are going to come from Loathing. So we want to look at Force of Fury. This is really key to the build. It's a big anti-crit buff and up to 6% reduced incoming damage on a 20-second cooldown. I mean, that's just absolutely huge. Especially the anti-crit. 15% less likely to be crit. If you're already at 0 or negative, I mean, you're basically making yourself and your Dark Protector immune to crits, unless it's something like maybe a Bright Wizzy or a Full Glass Cannon DPS. You can take the Shielded by Hatred for additional block based on resource. The parry based on resource is still really big, because remember, a guard can only be block or parried. Previously, I thought armor and toughness mitigated guard damage, but I found out recently that guard damage is true damage, so even more emphasis on block and parry. Wave of Scorn, still very useful in this spec. The toughness one, I guess it would depend on your gear level and what mode of gameplay you're doing, whether or not you would need the extra toughness. And then with that, if you're still feeling like you really need the additional defense on top of Force of Fury, the block and parry, you can look at something like Elite Training for that 100% parry. Disrupt again. The Healer Bully tactic is an option, though it probably is more common with two-handers. And then obviously the AP Drain can be useful. Again, it depends on what you think you're going to be fighting, how you want to build your group, or what classes you're trying to sync with, right? So I'd say those are probably the most common builds that I would recommend. Next, we'll go over some renown abilities with you guys. I don't think you're going to be too shocked here. I mean, it's pretty much the same as a lot of classes. Start with Futile Strikes. Get your any crit to 0. You're probably going to need FS3, maybe FS2, depending on what your gear looks like if you're lucky. Two-handed, obviously you want to max out parry. If you're going sword and board, max out the block, and then work on maxing out parry. I'm only run rank 62, so that's as far as I'd be able to get. If you're a little bit higher realm rank and you're able to get FS and max out parry, you can look at something like Quick Escape 1. I do run this on my knight, more for group play. I run this with the Fortress Weapon, because the Fortress Weapon also has a very similar proc at a 15% proc chance, I think. So I run both of these. If you get punted away from your group, or you're getting chained, just kind of taking fluff damage or whatever, and you're having a hard time keeping up with your guard targets, sometimes these can help. You just have to be very mindful of your global cooldown so that you don't automatically dispel it as soon as you get it. Otherwise, you could look at maybe some toughness, some wounds, or some strength as you need it. But keep the defenses pumped. I really can't stress that enough. Even if you're doing a strength or DPS tank, you still need a certain high level of defenses to still be effective. Next, we'll look at some gear builds. Like I said, my BG's only realm rank 62, so I've only got so many options I can show you guys. But I'll try to cover progression. I'll try to cover what I'm trying to use now and possible ideas for this later on. Right now, I am sitting in a Sentinel Conqueror Bloodlord split with the regen chest piece, Grim Shimmer, double flesh render rings, and then just a ruby to finish out my jewels with a parry buff, parry percentage. So I'm running 3-piece Sentinel for the wounds, 2-piece Conqueror for toughness, and 2-piece Bloodlord also for wounds. And it is worth noting that Conqueror would be a lot better replaced with the Vanquisher. Vanquisher can be useful for both two-hand and sword and board early on. I'm pretty sure I bought Conqueror when I was below rank 60, though, so that's just why I have Conqueror pieces. If you don't have, or you don't want to run regen, you could slot a 3rd piece of Conqueror or 3-piece Vanquisher into this for an additional wounds buff. Rings, you can switch to things like Amber or the Gunbad Diamond for block or parries. Beast Lord also has pretty good offensive stats, as well as the Bastion Slaver's Blood Moon Ring. Genesis Warrior Fragment has 3% parry, and I believe there's a second Genesis ring with parry as well. It might be an Undying. And I'll show you why I have 2 of these in my inventory in a minute. Weapons. If for two-handed spec, the parry buff can be really nice. It is worth mentioning that the procs from these BB weapons do not stack with class buffs. So something like Chosen, which has the suppression parry buff, would not actually benefit from this proc. But as far as I know, BGs will still get the full effect of this. So that'll give you an additional 10% parry disrupt. And this thing procs all the time. So if you're between guard damage and any additional damage coming in AoEs, you should have this up fairly often. Other two-handers, if you're really looking to do explosive damage, I mean, of course, there's Bloodlord. You can also look at the Central or the Sentinel drop, which is very similar to Fortress. And then the Fortress and the Renowned 60 weapons would be additional options if you're looking to go full offensive stats. Additional gear builds, I'm still trying to figure out what I like best, but I am also working on a Strength Bloodlord set too, for when I get to play with additional tanks and healers. As well as I might look into something a little more tanky. I might break down and get some Vanquisher and try later with some Sword and Board play too. So it comes down to how you want to run. Are you running small man, solo, 6-man, warband? But it'll be mostly between strengthness and toughness as to which stat you really want to pump up. Wounds, I try to keep all my tanks at least 8k hit points or more. That's kind of just a minimal expectation I set for my tank classes, regardless if I'm going two-hand and DPS-y or sword and board. I try to keep that as the minimum threshold for me. So just some rotational ideas. Depends, again, on what's in your group. But maintaining things like Brutal Smash gives you and your Dark Protector a fairly big strength buff. And you also want to look at feeding on weakness as well to maintain the toughness buff from this. And then you have your 2 big debuffs, which are Armor debuff, Horrific Wound, and Pitless Strike, I believe it's called, is the toughness debuff. Really handy to keep on your targets, especially if you're assisting a melee DPS. You'll get their damage to spike really hard. Mind Killer, if you're running the heal debuff, be mindful of this. You want to maintain this on enemy healers the best you can if you're running that tactic as well. Other than that, I think it's mostly just keeping your rotation tight, keeping your self buffs, your debuffs up on targets, making sure you're using the AoE snare to close the gap on targets or to snare large groups of tank trains. Try not to use your punt unless you have 90 to 100 hate. You really want to get the super punt out of this. But hopefully that helps set you guys in the right direction. Let me know in the comments below or in game if it helps you, and if you need any additional information, maybe we can get that sorted out for you. But I wish you guys the best of luck. War never ends.